Millionaire CEO saw a woman fired for helping his autistic daughter. He walked up and said, "You work for me now." The sliding doors of the crowded supermarket opened with a familiar hiss, letting in the scent of cleaning fluid and overripe bananas. Ethan Rivers stepped inside, his tall frame moving with quiet confidence. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he looked more like a boardroom executive than a man on a grocery run. In truth, he was both, but today, he was just a father. Next to him, holding tightly to his hand, was Sophie, 5 years old, petite. Her hair was tied into 2 neat braids. She clutched a well-loved stuffed fox to her chest, her wide gray eyes scanning the busy aisles with visible unease. Ethan leaned down and whispered softly, "We will be quick, okay?" Sophie did not respond. She rarely did in unfamiliar places. Her shoulders were tight, her steps small and cautious. The store was buzzing with shoppers, beeping carts, crackling intercoms, loud music playing from the speakers overhead. It was a cacophony, unbearable even for some adults. For Sophie, it was a minefield. They had barely reached the produce section when it began. Sophie's breathing quickened. She pulled back on Ethan's hand, her grip on the fox tightening. Her eyes darted toward the overhead lights, her lips parting in silent distress. Her little feet stepped back, then again. She began to tremble. Ethan crouched beside her, trying to block the surrounding noise with his body. "Sophie," he said gently, "look at me. You're safe. Just breathe with me, sweetheart." But she could not hear him, not really, not in the way that mattered. Her eyes glazed with panic. Her breathing turned into shallow gasps. Her fingers began fluttering, her version of trying to cope. And then she froze. A low moan escaped her lips, the start of a meltdown Ethan had fought so hard to prevent. A voice broke through the chaos, not loud, not commanding, but soft and steady. "Hi there." A young woman in a green supermarket vest approached slowly. Her honey blonde hair was tied in a tidy bun, and her name tag read, "Haley." She knelt down, careful not to crowd Sophie, and spoke in a calm, measured tone. "It is okay. You are safe," she said, placing her hand gently over her own heart, then extending it outward in a simple sign. Then, using slow gestures and soothing rhythm, she began guiding Sophie through a breathing exercise. Hands up, in. Hands down, out. Sophie's trembling slowed. Her lips followed the rhythm. In, out. Haley continued, never taking her eyes off the girl, never once raising her voice. After a few long seconds, Sophie's fingers stilled. Her gaze locked on Haley's hands. Then, so softly it could have been imagined, Sophie whispered, "Safe." Haley smiled. "Yes, safe." Sophie reached forward and gently took Haley's hand. Ethan watched, stunned. His daughter had never done that with a stranger before. But the moment was broken. A man stormed over, graying hair, red face, clipboard in hand. The store manager. "Haley, what are you doing? This is not your job. You left your station." Haley stood, still holding Sophie's hand loosely. "She needed help," she said calmly. "I was trying to—" "You were trying to not do your job. I don't care what excuse you have. You are done. Turn in your badge." A hush fell over the nearby shoppers. Ethan stood up, face unreadable. Haley looked down. She unclipped her name tag, her hands trembling now. She bent to return it, lips pressed together. That was when Ethan stepped forward. He pulled a card from his wallet, handed it to her, and spoke in a voice that silenced the entire aisle. "You do not work for them anymore," he said. He glanced at Sophie, who still had her small hand wrapped around Haley's fingers. Then he looked back at Haley. "You work for me now." Gasps echoed around them. Haley blinked, too stunned to reply. Sophie, unaware of the commotion, leaned her head against Haley's arm. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Rivers realized he had just seen something money could not buy. Someone who heard his daughter, even when she said nothing at all. Haley Monroe had not expected to hear from him again. After the whirlwind at the supermarket, after the way his voice had cut through the noise, She went home thinking maybe he had spoken in the heat of the moment. A wealthy father, grateful, reacting. She had been fired, yes. But people said things when emotions ran high. So when her phone rang the next morning and the name Ethan Rivers appeared, her first instinct was to freeze. Then, cautiously, she answered. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I am offering you a job." "A job?" she repeated, still in disbelief. "A position. As Sophie's personal support companion, someone she can trust, someone to help her connect." Haley's heart jumped. "I am not certified," she said quickly. "I took some classes, volunteered, but I am not a therapist." "I know that," Ethan replied, "but what you have no program teaches." He paused. "You listened with your heart," he said, and she listened back. That afternoon, Haley stood outside a tall black gate, hesitating before pressing the buzzer. The house was sleek but warm, softened by climbing vines and low golden light. A home that belonged to a man who once lived in silence until a little girl changed everything. The housekeeper welcomed her inside. Ethan waited near the stairs, in a navy sweater instead of a suit. Less CEO, more father. He nodded, though his gaze kept drifting down the hallway. "She's in her art room," he said. "She draws when she is unsure." Haley followed him quietly until they reached a bright room at the end. On the floor, Sophie sat cross-legged, facing away, scribbling with deep focus. Her stuffed fox rested by her side. Haley said nothing. She sat gently on the rug, several feet away, and pulled a pencil from her tote. She found blank paper on the table nearby and began to draw, not looking directly at the girl. A sun, a tree, a little figure with pigtails and a fox. Sophie did not respond. Haley kept going. She added a girl with a green shirt and glittery shoes. Then drew the same fox again, twice, before slowly sliding the paper across the floor. Sophie paused. Then, gradually, she turned her head. For the first time, she looked at Haley. Not through her, not past her, at her. There was no fear, no flinch, just quiet curiosity. Haley smiled. "Hi," she whispered. Sophie said nothing, but she also did not look away. The two of them remained in that sunlit room, Haley sketching hearts, Sophie drawing circles, speaking in shared silence. When it was time to leave, Haley stood, collected her things, and thanked Ethan gently before heading toward the door. Then she felt a tug on her sleeve. She turned. Sophie stood there, holding her fox close, eyes wide and searching. One hand was stained with purple marker. She glanced at her father, tugged on his arm, and leaned close. "She's like Pink," Sophie whispered, barely audible. Ethan froze. He knelt beside her, stunned. "You said pink." Sophie nodded. Pink, the color she used to hate, too loud, too scary. She never described anything as pink unless she wanted it far away. And now, it was a word of comfort. Ethan turned toward Haley. For once, there was no distance in his eyes, no calculation, just awe and gratitude. He said nothing. He only nodded. And in that moment, he knew. Haley was not just the kind woman from the supermarket who calmed a child once. She was someone Sophie had chosen, without pressure, without fear. And to Ethan, that meant more than any credential ever could. She had stepped into a world few dared to enter. Not because she had to, but because she knew how. Through patience, through silence, through Pink. From that first quiet connection, something began to shift. Haley started visiting Sophie 3 times a week. The settings were always carefully chosen, places without crowds or loud sounds. A bench under the trees at the park, a corner table in the library's children's section, a sunny room at home filled with pillows and an art easel. No strict routines, no pressure, just presence. Each time Haley brought something simple, a new set of markers, a stack of paint chips for the feelings color game, emotion cards with drawn faces, happy, nervous, calm, stormy. She would sit beside Sophie or a few feet away, never forcing closeness. The girl set the pace. Some days Sophie kept her distance. Other days, she quietly scooted closer. When Sophie felt overwhelmed, Haley used their color cards: blue for calm, red for overstimulated, yellow for excited. Then she'd hold up her own, sharing how she felt too. It became their private language. Sophie, once too afraid to use even signs, started pointing, then nodding, then gently pressing her fingers to colors or sketching expressions in crayon. When she was brave, she made shapes in the air. A lopsided heart, two fingers pressed together, a swirl for confused. Ethan watched from afar. He never interrupted. Always nearby with his laptop, pretending to work, but his eyes stayed fixed on the two of them. His daughter was blooming, cautiously but steadily. He had not seen this light in her since Lena died. Maybe ever. And Haley? Haley was the one holding the lantern. One Tuesday afternoon, Haley arrived with storybooks tucked under her arm and a scarf Sophie had left at the library. When she entered the house, she stopped. Something was different. Sophie's art room, once bare and bright, had been transformed. The walls were now painted in calming tones: sage green, sky blue, lavender. The same hues from Haley's emotion cards. Floating shelves held framed pieces of Sophie's art, stick figures holding hands, swirling scribbles in pastel tones, bold smudges titled "Safe" or "Stormy." A new rug covered the floor, soft, textured, chosen carefully for sensory comfort. But what caught Haley's eye was the small wooden box on the center table. Hand-carved, her name on it in gentle script, Miss Haley's Tools. She opened it slowly. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages labeled by week. New paintbrushes, a sensory squeeze ball, a child-sized pair of noise-canceling headphones, and 3 advanced books on emotional development for children with autism, the exact titles she'd once mentioned in passing to Ethan. She hadn't thought he'd remembered, but clearly, he had been listening to everything. She heard footsteps. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching quietly. Haley blinked, overwhelmed. "You didn't have to," she began. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." For a long moment, she stood holding the box like something fragile. Then, gently, she placed it back and crossed to the wall, where one of Sophie's newer drawings hung. 3 figures, one tall with glasses, one small with a fox, and one with long yellow hair. Sophie peeked in from the hallway. Seeing Haley, she ran in and took her hand. Then, softly, she raised Haley's arm and placed it over her own shoulder. Her version of a hug. Ethan stood in the doorway, heart full. Not with grief, but with something closer to hope. For the first time in years, it felt like this house wasn't full of silence anymore. It was full of understanding. It was a quiet evening, the kind of quiet that only happens when a child is asleep, and there are no more dishes to wash, no more emails to send, no more questions to answer. Ethan sat on the couch, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. Haley sat across from him, legs tucked beneath her, sipping her own. The lights were dimmed, the house wrapped in a kind of stillness that made truths easier to say. He had not planned to talk about Lena, but the silence made space for it. "She died the day Sophie was born," Ethan said quietly. Haley looked up, her expression softening instantly. "There were complications," he continued. "Everything happened so fast. One minute, I was holding her hand. The next, I was holding a death certificate and a baby who wouldn't stop crying." Haley didn't interrupt. She didn't offer sympathy. She simply listened, really listened, the way she always did. "I tried everything," Ethan went on. "The best therapists, the most prestigious programs. I spent a fortune on experts who never even got Sophie to look them in the eye." His voice grew tight. She would only draw. That was the only way she would speak. He stared into his tea, like he could find answers in the steam. "I blamed myself. I buried myself in work, built a company out of grief, told myself if I just succeeded enough, made enough, fixed enough, it would mean I was still a good father. There was a long silence between them, filled with the weight of what he had carried alone. Then Haley set her mug down, folded her hands in her lap, and said quietly, "My little brother has ADHD." Ethan looked up. "He's brilliant, creative, funny, but growing up, he was a handful." She smiled faintly. "When our parents split, I became the only constant he had. I went to school with him, came home to cook for him, did homework with him while working 2 part-time jobs." She exhaled. "There were days I wanted to fall apart, but I couldn't. I had to be the stable one, the strong one, because no one else was going to do it." Ethan's eyes softened. Haley glanced down, then looked up again, her voice quieter now. "I understand what it means to be forced to grow up too fast, to feel like you have to be perfect, when all you really want is for someone to say, 'It's okay, you're allowed to break.'" The words sat between them, gently unspoken after that. Then came the night. It was around 2 a.m. when the silence was broken by a high, panicked cry. Sophie's. Haley, who had offered to stay overnight while Ethan caught up on work, rushed down the hallway. She found Sophie curled in her bed, clutching her bunny, tears streaking her cheeks. "Shh," Haley whispered, sitting beside her. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to reason. She simply wrapped her arms around the little girl and began to hum, soft, low, steady, a lullaby with no words, just melody and warmth. Sophie's sobs slowed, her breathing eased. Ethan, drawn by the noise, stopped outside the door. He stood in the hallway, watching through the small opening. He saw his daughter wrapped in safety. He saw Haley rocking gently, her eyes closed, singing something older than language. His breath caught. His eyes welled with tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. Haley looked up and saw him there, frozen, backlit by the hallway light, shoulders sagging like they carried a world. Without a word, she reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. It was the smallest gesture, but it was also the first time anyone had reached into his grief and touched it without flinching. Ethan didn't pull away. He closed his eyes. And for the first time since Lena died, he let someone be there when he wasn't strong. It was Haley's idea. "There's a therapeutic art workshop this weekend," she said, handing Ethan a flyer across the kitchen counter. "It's for kids on the spectrum. Might be good for Sophie to express herself, be around others." Ethan glanced at the paper, then looked at Sophie, who sat at the dining table, head down over her sketchpad. He nodded. "Let's try it." The workshop was held in a cozy art center filled with natural light. Tables were laid out with paints, crayons, and modeling clay. Volunteers moved gently, speaking softly, never forcing interaction. At first, Sophie clung to Haley's side, clutching her bunny tightly. "It's okay," Haley whispered, crouching beside her. "We can just sit and watch." They took a seat at a corner table. Haley picked up a brush, dipped it into pale pink paint, and began drawing slow swirls on paper. She said nothing, just painted. Sophie peeked sideways, then reached for a crayon. By the end of the session, Sophie had drawn something new. 3 figures, hand in hand, a tall man, a woman with yellow hair, and a little girl in a pink dress, all smiling. It was the first time Sophie had drawn herself in pink, and the first time she had drawn the 3 of them together. When she showed the drawing to Haley, her small hands were steady. She tapped each figure gently, one by one, her way of saying, "You, me, us." Haley only nodded, her smile trembling slightly. She didn't trust herself to speak. That night, Ethan and Haley stood on the rooftop terrace of his penthouse, city lights stretching out below. Inside, Sophie was asleep, the drawing tucked under her pillow. They leaned on the railing in quiet. "You didn't just help Sophie," Ethan said. "You helped me realize that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it heals." Haley turned, caught off guard by the rawness in his voice. "She needed someone to meet her where she is," Ethan continued. "Not pull her into a world she wasn't ready for. You did that, and you never asked for anything." Haley smiled faintly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She gave me more than I gave her. Silence settled again, this time peaceful. 2 nights later, Ethan asked Haley to take a drive with him. He didn't explain where they were going. They pulled up to a quiet cemetery just as the sun dipped low. They walked slowly until he stopped at a modest stone. Lena Rivers, beloved wife and mother. Ethan knelt, pulling a small frame from a canvas bag. Inside was Sophie's drawing, laminated, preserved. He set it at the base of the headstone, adjusting it carefully. "I come here every month," he said softly, "to talk to her, tell her about Sophie. I've never brought anyone else." Haley stood silently beside him, unsure of what to say. "I think," he continued, still looking at the drawing, "if she were here, she'd be grateful you are." Haley's throat tightened. "She was kind," Ethan said, rising. Soft-spoken, but fierce when it came to people she loved. He turned to face Haley, voice lowering. "She would have seen you, the way I do." The words weren't romantic or pressured, just honest. Haley didn't look away. Instead, she opened her bag and pulled out a charm. 3 small twine and bead circles, interwoven. "Sophie and I made this last week," she said, placing it gently beside the frame. "She said it was for someone who watches from the sky." Ethan's eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them again, he didn't speak. He didn't need to, because Haley already understood. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Ethan, Haley, and Sophie were sitting on a bench in the park, each with a cone of ice cream in hand. Sophie was unusually relaxed, swinging her legs as she licked at her strawberry scoop, her new favorite, ever since Haley introduced it. They were laughing, one of those rare, gentle moments when everything felt settled. Until a voice broke through the calm. "Ethan." He turned sharply, recognizing the voice before his eyes confirmed it. Amanda Rivers. She stood a few feet away, her tailored coat immaculate, her expression unreadable. The last time he'd seen her was in a hospital room, 5 years ago, when she screamed through tears and grief that his choices had killed her daughter. "Mom?" Sophie's ice cream slipped from her hand. She looked up at Ethan, confused by the tension that suddenly crackled in the air. Ethan stood slowly, shielding Sophie with his body, but saying nothing yet. Amanda's gaze shifted, past Ethan, straight to Sophie, then to Haley. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I heard you were here," she said to Ethan. "It took me long enough to find you." Ethan's voice was calm, careful. "Why now?" Amanda exhaled. "Because she's my granddaughter, and I want to know her. It's time." Before Ethan could reply, Amanda looked at Haley, eyes narrowing. "And who is this?" she asked. Haley stood, offering a polite but restrained smile. "Haley, I help take care of Sophie." Amanda's tone sharpened, each word slicing the air. "Help? What kind of help can a girl from a grocery store offer a child like her?" Haley froze. Sophie stiffened beside her, gripping Haley's hand tighter. Ethan's jaw clenched. "That's enough." Amanda ignored him, her voice rising just enough for Sophie to hear every word. "She needs a real mother, not a supermarket waitress studying to be a teacher." Sophie whimpered, pulling at her dress, her breathing shallow and uneven. Haley immediately crouched down, cupping Sophie's face. "It's okay, honey. You're safe. We're here." But Sophie was already spiraling, rocking, mumbling, overwhelmed by a storm of emotion she couldn't name. Haley gently led her to the grass and sat with her, humming lowly, hands moving in soft, familiar signs. Amanda watched, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. Later that evening, after Sophie had calmed and gone to bed, Ethan and Haley sat in the kitchen, the silence heavy between them. "She wants time with Sophie," Ethan finally said. Haley nodded, though her eyes were clouded. "She's her grandmother. You can't erase that." Ethan looked tortured. "But Sophie barely knows her. And after today, she still deserves the chance to know her family," Haley said softly. He sighed, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't know what the right thing is. I don't want Sophie to feel abandoned by anyone. But I also can't let anyone make her feel unsafe, even Amanda. Haley reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. Then you'll make the decision that keeps her heart whole. A few days later, Ethan made his choice. He called Haley to the garden behind the house, where Sophie was playing quietly with finger paint. "I've decided to let Amanda spend time with Sophie," he said. Haley nodded slowly. "Of course. I think they should have a few weeks together. Alone," Ethan added, his voice lower now. Haley's breath hitched, but she didn't argue. "I understand," she said. Then gently, "If that's what's best for her, I'll step back. But I'm not going anywhere, Ethan. I'll always be close, just not in the way she needs right now." Her words didn't sting. They settled into him like a balm, because there was no resentment, only love. As she turned to leave, Sophie looked up and signed. "You come back?" Haley bent down, brushing paint from Sophie's nose, and signed back with a small smile. "Always." The days felt quieter without Haley. Sophie no longer ran to the garden in the mornings. Her crayons stayed tucked away. The easel in the corner, once vibrant with color, now stood blank. Amanda tried everything: books, puzzles, even cookies from Lena's old recipe. But Sophie stayed distant. No eye contact, no words, no smiles. Every night, Amanda found her curled in bed, clutching the pink headband Haley had embroidered with a tiny S. The first few nights, Amanda tried to take it, thinking it was a crutch. But the way Sophie let out a silent, panicked cry stopped her cold. One evening, Amanda sat at the kitchen table, staring at an untouched plate of mac and cheese. Across the room, Sophie sat on the floor, gently rocking back and forth. Amanda pressed her hands together and whispered, "She doesn't even see me." Haley had returned to routine. She worked part-time at a learning center, resumed evening courses, and tried, not very successfully, not to think about Sophie every day. But she failed. Every time she saw a child with light-up shoes, she thought of Sophie. Every time she saw a pink crayon, her chest ached. So she wrote a letter, not for Sophie, not to Ethan, but to name what she couldn't shake. She folded it and gave it to Ethan's assistant. That evening, Ethan read it. "I didn't know what love was until a little girl held my hand without saying a word. And I knew I was already hers." He sat still for a long time, eyes on the city lights outside the window, heart full of something he couldn't name, longing, maybe, hope. The next morning, before sunrise, a knock came at his door. Amanda stood there, coat on, eyes tired. Beside her, Sophie, silent, half asleep, her head resting on Amanda's side. "She hasn't smiled in days," Amanda said. "She doesn't speak, not even with her eyes." Ethan dropped to one knee and pulled Sophie into his arms. She didn't resist, didn't move, just rested her head against his shoulder like a leaf clinging to glass. "I thought blood would be enough," Amanda whispered. "But she doesn't need my name. She needs safety, and she only found that in one place." Behind them, the gate opened. Haley. Ethan had called her the night before, asking her to come. No explanation, just, "Please." Amanda turned and saw her. Haley, hair pulled back, face unsure. She stood frozen at the edge of the porch. "She missed you," Amanda said gently. Sophie stirred. She opened her eyes, looked across the porch and blinked. Then, quietly, she slid down from Ethan's arms, walked over to Haley, and pressed her forehead to Haley's knee. Haley knelt down slowly. Sophie raised her hands, fingers trembling, and signed, "Safe." Haley's eyes filled. She signed back, "Always." Amanda stepped down the porch steps, wiping her eyes. Her voice shook as she said, "I'm sorry for everything, and thank you for loving her the way she needs to be loved." Ethan stepped beside Haley, placing a steady hand on her back. No one said more. They didn't need to. That morning, the sun rose gently over the house. Sophie sat between the two people who understood her best, nestled in the silence they all shared. And for the first time in weeks, she reached for a crayon. Pink. The rain was soft that afternoon, barely more than a mist. The sky wore a quiet gray, and the sidewalks glistened like memories. Ethan parked the car in front of the same little ice cream shop where everything had unraveled months before. The doorbell chimed as they stepped in. Haley, Ethan, and Sophie, hand in hand. Sophie, now a little taller, a little more expressive, wore her favorite denim jacket and sneakers with star patches. She immediately rushed to the window seat, she remembered, where she once sat holding Haley's hand in silence. Haley carried a small leather-bound book, worn at the edges. She waited until Sophie had chosen her strawberry swirl before sliding into the booth beside her. Ethan sat across, eyes full of something between gratitude and awe. "What's that?" Sophie asked, pointing at the book. Haley opened it, page by page, revealing drawings, each one a frozen moment in time. Crayon lines of hands reaching, circles representing people, trees with oversized leaves. Some were messy, chaotic. Others were gentle, filled with soft colors and calm spaces. "These are your drawings," Haley said, smiling. "All the ones I saved, from the very beginning." Sophie's fingers stopped at one picture. 3 figures, stick arms joined, standing beneath a pink sun. She traced each shape, her eyes wide. She turned to Haley, then to Ethan, and lifted her hands. "This is family, right?" Haley's breath caught. She nodded, pulling Sophie into a hug. "Yes," she whispered. "This is family." The moment stretched, warm and unspoken. Ethan cleared his throat and reached into his coat pocket. He slid a small navy blue box onto the table. Haley blinked. "Ethan?" He didn't say a word. Instead, he opened the box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace. Hanging from the chain was a simple charm. 3 interlocked fingers, curved in the exact shape of the sign for always, a symbol Haley had once taught Sophie during their first few weeks together. Ethan looked at her, then raised his hands and signed, "Will you be our always?" Haley covered her mouth, tears brimming, then reached for his hands with hers. "I already am," she signed back, smiling through the tears. Sophie clapped, completely understanding in her own way, her laughter like bells in the quiet rain. 1 year later. The sign above the small brick building read, "Always Home." Inside, sunlight poured through wide windows. The walls were painted in soft blues and greens, and shelves were filled with tactile toys, storybooks, and sensory tools. At the front desk, a hand-painted plaque read, "Love is not what you say, it's what you show." Haley walked through the hallway, stopping to kneel beside a new child sitting nervously by the door. With a calm smile, she signed, "Hello, safe." And right beside her, proudly wearing her own little name tag, was Sophie Rivers, assistant helper. Sophie turned to the new child and mimicked Haley's signs, slowly and clearly. The boy smiled. Ethan sat at the back of the room, arms folded, his eyes shining. He wore no tie today, just a soft gray sweater and a look of peace he hadn't known in years. Haley caught his gaze. He gave her a small nod, the kind that meant, "Thank you, I love you, and we made it, all at once." She returned it with a smile. Because in a world that often spoke too fast and listened too little, they had found their rhythm, not in grand declarations, but in quiet signs, in gentle hands, and in choosing each other every single day. Thank you for watching this heartwarming journey of quiet love, second chances, and the family we choose. If this story touched something in you, whether it was Sophie's strength, Haley's compassion, or Ethan's silent healing, don't forget to let us know. Tap the hype button to show your love, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales that speak not just to your ears, but to your heart. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones whispered without a word. We'll see you in the next chapter.